Hi everybody, and welcome back to our Chapter 2 discussion on talent identification and profiling. Now that we've kind of talked about the modeling and assessment process, we need to actually start to begin the process. And this usually starts with identifying our talent and how do we profile our athletes. So talent identification within itself is actually 4 different things all combined together. Talent identification, as kind of a definition, is the term we use to describe the scientific process to identify an individual with some sort of athletic talent. To do this, we have to go through a talent detection and a talent selection process. So talent detection is the process of finding talent outside of the sport. This is usually some sort of screening event, maybe within a PE class or within a community, that's going to find athletes and individuals with athletic ability. Talent selection, on the other hand, is when we're identifying talent within the sport. So maybe this individual is a basketball player and we'd say, hey, you are going to be a point guard. Or we have a basketball player and say, actually, you may be playing the wrong sport. Maybe we should send you over here. And then pulling all of this together, we start to go through the process of talent development. So this is when we have identified the talent, and now we're going to give that individual the opportunity to achieve their full potential in an environment that is going to ideally include high quality, well-educated coaching, some sort of support from sports science professionals and sport medicine professionals, the ability to be immersed in quality and productive competition, things that challenge individuals' skills without overwhelming them, and then hopefully a philosophy of holistic athletic development so that this athlete is treated as a whole person, not just somebody that's there to compete and represent whatever group they're working for. So talent identification has kind of gotten a bad rap and has quite a bit of stigma associated with it. And this mostly comes from very aggressive sports systems like the former Eastern Bloc countries, where a lot of times athletes were identified, they were then taken out of their homes, there were questionable sports science practices, rampant performance-enhancing drug use, and that's kind of what our view of talent development is kind of shaped by. However, while that may still happen in some areas, unfortunately, that's not really what talent identification looks like in the modern day. And because there are healthy and well-supported and well-funded talent identification programs out there, that stigma is starting to go away and become more accepted. So going through a talent identification process, like this can be something as simple as sending your child to an all-comers summer camp for basketball. And, they'll be assessed and screened, and people kind of are like, oh, you'd be better suited for this position, or maybe you're not a basketball player, but instead you're a volleyball player. These things happen all throughout the world, but not so much in the US. This happens in some sports like gymnastics, but not all of them. But going through this talent identification process does have several benefits. So the first is if you're dealing with a youth athlete, this is going to help direct that child towards an event that is going to best suit them physically with what their natural attributes are, but can also steer them towards a sport that's going to benefit them psychologically. So just because an individual is very strong, but maybe they're shy, maybe something like weightlifting or powerlifting would be more beneficial for them than, say, something like football, where there's that big team component. So you want to make sure there's a balance between physical demands and psychological demands. Also, talent identification programs tend to have that holistic care focus. It just kind of builds into the nature of the program. So this athlete's physical health and well-being are going to be in the top consideration. Also, when you're in a talent identification program, oftentimes you're going to receive some sort of specialized coaching, and you're going to get specialized support from sports science professionals, athletic trainers, sports psychologists. You're going to get a much better benefit than just somebody that's learning off of the street. Also, oftentimes talent identification programs have some sort of vocational support after the completion of an individual's competitive career. So if you are sponsored by, say, a country that has a talent identification program, and you're identified as like a star baseball player when you're 8 years old, and you play kind of through the ranks, maybe you represent an Olympic team, but you're 28, you've aged out of the program, or you've gotten injured. Well, these programs will actually sit down and help teach these individuals vocation skills so they can get a job when they're done. So even though they get a bad rap sometimes, these talent identification programs can be very helpful if done right. So if we're going to use a talent identification program, what does it take for them to be successful? So the first important concept is going to be understanding the important aspects of what it takes to be successful in competition. Once you kind of understand those important aspects, you can start recording data sets on these athletes that record those important aspects. This will also allow you to gather a set of normative or comparative data to kind of scale individuals for profiling. And then you can use this data to construct a profile of that athlete, and then you can interpret that profile in the selection process or use it as a basis for ongoing training program modifications. So now that we've kind of talked about the process and what needs to be involved, let's kind of zoom in a little bit on general talent identification screenings. So the first thing you want to consider when you're doing a general talent identification screening are any hereditary factors that could play into this particular individual's ability to perform. So we know genetics is going to play a fairly decent role in someone's talent. And we know this based off of several studies that have been done that did a comparison of sons and fathers and then also looking at twins. And we know that there are some critical athletic traits that tend to run in families. These include maximal aerobic power, so your VO2 max, also your maximal aerobic and anaerobic capacities, your maximal mechanical power and muscle force, so your general strength capacity and endurance capacity. BMI and somatotypes are kind of your body shape and your body makeup, as well as maturation times and muscle area and fiber distribution. So all of these things are going to be incredibly important and tend to be inherited. This also means that a fundamental goal of the talent identification process should be to determine any innate differences in our genetic potential that exist within a population. So I remember being a high school coach and not really understanding this process quite yet, but I kind of inherently knew if I had a thrower whose brother was very talented in a sport, I was kind of excited to have that athlete too. Or I had a female thrower one year who was like, oh yeah, her dad played in the NFL. So I was like, oh yeah, she'll be a great thrower. Well, this is kind of the thought process that's going through when we look at hereditary factors. The next kind of two considerations is the next one is time spent in the sport. So when you're getting an athlete to do a general talent identification screening on, first we need to ask how long has this athlete been participating in the sport and how much specialized training have they had. If they're already a very talented athlete and they've had very little training, that means they have a lot of upside. They can get better. Or if you're screening somebody and they've been doing this for a very long time, they may have already reached their full athletic potential. So we need to kind of pay attention to this when we're going through our screening process. The next is looking at this individual's maturity. So the maturation process and puberty kind of works on a sliding scale for all individuals. So some people develop earlier, some develop later in life. And that's all okay and valid. But we do know that individuals who tend to mature earlier are often going to be our taller individuals. They tend to be heavier, and this can be from muscle mass or just general fat mass. They also tend to be more powerful and faster than their late maturation counterparts. Now, depending on your sport, this means that this could be an advantage or a disadvantage. So in a sport like football, where bigger, faster, stronger is going to be a big deal, being an early maturer matters. However, in a sport like gymnastics, where you want to be as petite as possible, being a late maturer would be beneficial. So this kind of plays one of two ways. However, since we do have this kind of range in maturation status, This can lead to some selection biases in youth sports, particularly if they're grouped by chronological age as opposed to physiological age. Also, this kind of bias can lead to an over-reliance on early maturity, and then these early maturers can actually lack skill development because they were just so much bigger and stronger than everybody else, they could get away with it. So, things to consider. Next, when we're looking at an athlete, we want to look at their size and proportionality. Proportionality can be a very important self-selection factor in a different variety of sports. This means that we can actually forecast an individual or a team performance based on height and body mass alone. It's a pretty good predictor. We can also predict the adult height from a youth athlete. We can do this in several different ways. So first, in America, we have the CDC formulas, but there's other formulas out there in the world. But we can use formulas and growth curves based on several different longitudinal research studies. And we can kind of guess and estimate a youth athlete's adult height somewhere around 3 to 6 centimeters. So it's fairly accurate. We can also do x-rays of the hand and wrist to determine a child's skeletal age. And we do this using the Grulich and Piles Atlas. Or we can turn around and use something called the Tanner scales. And the Tanner scales are an assessment of the stage where an individual is in puberty. So are they in early puberty or prepubescent all the way up through fully developed? So looking at these 3 different scales, we can kind of estimate where somebody is and where they are going with their size and proportionality. We also know that growth proportions are kind of thought to remain stable as an athlete goes through puberty and adolescence. So even though we're going to have like legs lengthen before arms and arms lengthen before torsos, your general proportions as a human being tend to stay the same as we go through puberty and adolescence. But we want to take care that during puberty and adolescence, we don't exclude any athletes solely based on absolute size and proportionality criteria. A good example of this is my roommate from college. She was a rower, or on the crew team, you may know it as that. And if you know anything about crew or rowing, if you are not like 6 foot tall or bigger, and super strong and super fit, nobody really wants to look at you as a crew athlete unless you're a coxswain, which are these tiny, tiny little people that they shove in the front of the boat to steer. And you want them to be as small and light as possible because they're essentially dead weight. Well, Jen was an incredibly amazing rower in college, but she is kind of short and compact. She's 5'8" and very, very strong. So she is not the ideal size or proportion for a crew athlete, but she got a full ride scholarship to college to do it. So you have to kind of make some considerations for that. The next thing we want to look at is somatotypes. So this is kind of the in-between between body composition and body sizes and proportions. So somatotypes are going to classify an athlete either as an ectomorph, mesomorph, or endomorph based on their body composition, muscle mass, and body shape. So our ectomorphs we tend to think of as slender and tall builds. Mesomorphs are very kind of muscular, and endomorphs are going to carry more body fat. Our ectomorph body types tend to remain stable throughout growth and development, while mesomorphs and endomorphs can be more variable. So we're going to have different body types that are going to work better in different sports, but we're going to talk about that more in Chapter 4. But looking at somatotypes as a measurement tool, we know that in males, somatotype rankings are going to give us some predictions of performance near the end of puberty. So this doesn't work very well in young children. However, when we start looking at females and somatotypes, this relationship gets a lot weaker in predicting performance. And this is because females generally have to carry more body fat, which makes them more endomorphic in character than males. So it kind of muddies the predictions scales. However, if you're going to use somatotyping, it's best to use it with other performance criteria. Next, we're going to look at body composition. So like somatotypes, this is only a general indicator of high-level sports performance. Body fat levels and distributions are going to vary greatly from birth to about 5 or 6 years of age. Then they stabilize for a little bit. And then they're going to change again rapidly during puberty through young adulthood. So again, you need to use body composition together with other factors. Also, the optimal body composition is going to vary by sport. There's some sports where a lower body fat percentage would be desired, things like gymnastics and endurance running, and this is because a power to weight ratio matters. So you want to carry the least amount of weight while generating the most power. This is going to just mean that I have to carry my body through space, and I want to have as little load to carry as possible while being as strong as possible. On the other side, there are some sports where a higher body fat percentage is desired, things like swimming and ultra marathon. In swimming, this is because body fat actually helps with buoyancy and makes it easier to swim. If you're an ultra marathon runner, having some higher body fat levels is actually going to act as fuel storage as you go through your runs. So there's some different sports that have different expectations. Next, we'll look at things like posture. So when we look at posture, kind of like proportionality, it's going to be an important self-selection factor for sports participation. It's going to vary greatly both in the sport population and in the general population, but it can be partially modified through flexibility and strength training. If you're going to modify somebody's posture, the earlier you do it, the better. So if you are early in development, so prepubescent through adolescence, you actually have a shot at changing somebody's posture. However, once you get into late adolescence and adulthood, posture tends to get fixed and it's a lot harder to change. Next is going to be strength and power. This is going to be essential to performance in many sports. We know that the strength levels around a child's peak height velocity can predict adult strength levels, especially in males. So we can kind of get some predictions from youth into adulthood here. Next, we want to look at flexibility. This is kind of a gray area for us in research. Very little is known about the long-term stability of flexibility throughout the lifespan. But we do know that many sports have specialized flexibility requirements. So each sport is going to have a different set of criteria that meets the optimal flexibility, mobility, and range of motion for that sport. So something to consider with different sports. So for example, I'm going to hold myself up as an example here for a discus thrower. When I was a discus thrower, the requirements of my sport meant that I needed to have very flexible shoulders and a very flexible spine so that I can kind of contort myself in these positions to optimize my throwing angle. However, my hamstrings have the flexibility of a 2x4. They don't really bend, but it was actually beneficial to have tight hamstrings because it gave me something to push off of when I was competing. So that would be a specialized flexibility requirement. If you looked at me as a whole, as a flexible person, I was not very flexible, but I was very regionally flexible in my shoulders and my back. Now looking into speed, like flexibility, we don't have a lot of information about the correlation between general speed and sports performance. But the thing we do know we have a correlation with is a knowledge of running speed. So a lot of times you'll see individuals go through sprint training or speed training, but speed is a lot more than just that. But since we know there's a correlation here, speed training techniques are going to be well known and they're rather commonplace in terms of training, but athletes should be at least 10 years of age before undergoing any specialized speed training to allow them time to develop and to mitigate the risks of injury. The final component of a physical capacity screening is to look at the individual's health status. So before participating, all athletes should be screened to assess their preparedness for vigorous sport or physical activity. In America, we know this as going in for your sports physical. When you go in for your sports physical, particular attention is going to be paid to your cardiorespiratory and musculoskeletal systems. These tend to be the systems that are the most taxed when participating in vigorous physical activity. So it is important to note that athletes can have medical conditions and completely healthily in their sport. but these medical conditions need to be well controlled and not pose a health risk to themselves or others. So now we kind of come into something called the new paradigm. So if you hadn't noticed in our discussion so far, a lot of our talent detection and talent identification has been focused on youth athletes. But what about everybody else? This brings up an interesting point of something called an alternative talent pool. And this is going to focus on talent transfer. So this is when you have an individual who has a set of skills that they have developed in one sport that would transfer into another sport. This happens quite a bit where you have people that are willing and wanting to still participate in sport or physical activity, but they've either aged out, injured out, or some other reason have had to leave their first sport of choice. So the example I hold up here is, let's say we have a football lineman. He's had 2 ACL reconstructive surgeries, and if he continues to play football, the odds of him injuring his knees again are pretty high. But from football, he has explosive strength, explosive power, he has a good body size. This would transfer well into another sport, like a track event like shot put and hammer, which would be much safer for his body. This is an example of talent transfer. So when we're going to develop athletes, we need to not only consider who we can get initially, but also who we can transfer into our talent pool. So if you have time, take a moment and kind of watch this. So talent identification may be taking a new direction, and it could be, can we genetically modify our athletes to make them the best athlete they can be? So take a moment on your own, pause the video, and go check this out. Whoops, my bad. Next. So now that we've identified our talent, now we need to profile them. So profiling is the process of identifying each athlete's unique combination of strengths and weaknesses, and then developing some sort of remediation or training plan to maximize the talents that they already have and kind of bring up any weaknesses they have to kind of a baseline level. So there are 3 different types of profiling. We have general profiling, specific profiling, and general health status profiling. So general profiling is probably what you're most familiar with, and this is done in a detrained state and typically administered at the start of the season. Basically, we put everybody through the paces and kind of see where they're at. Once we have their data, we compare them against themselves or their teammates or elite performers. There's some level of comparison that occurs. And then we take this data and we plan an appropriate training progression for general health and sport-specific skills. This general profiling tends to be more valuable for our youth and developing athletes than our elite adults. Elite adults are already pretty much maxed out. So there's not a lot that we can do to continue to modify them up to a certain point. However, there's a lot of room for improvement in youth and developing athletes. This is where this tends to be used. Specific profiling, on the other hand, is when we're working with our elite or senior athletes. And this is because these things are won by very tiny, small margins. So think swimming, track, where wins and losses are fractions of a second. Specific profiling is going to be very common assessments in profiling. This can be done as often as every 2 weeks, but it's more likely to assess monthly, which gives us a 3-to-1 training cycle. So 3 weeks of training, 1 week of assessment. However, if a sport is more skill-orientated, so there's a lot of technique involved, specific profiling may be done every 6 months, so you have time for adaptations to training. So think of things like giving somebody 6 months to change their golf swing. And then the final profiling is general health status profiling. Basically, this is just when you do periodic checks, either by a sports medicine professional, team doctor, somebody, athletic trainer perhaps, and they're just checking in the general health status of the athlete. Typically we think of this as a pre-participation screening, but this really should be happening throughout the season because we want our athletes to be healthy and as injury-free as possible. So when you're going through the profiling process, there's a lot of different things that you can do to set up the profile. You can do scientific testing. and you have some examples over here in the table on the left, but these need to be highly specific to the needs of the sport. So for example, if I'm working with a runner and I look over here, physical capacity tests, I probably would want to know things about their height and their weight, maybe their body composition. I'd also want to know things about, say, their speed of movement. Then going down to a physiological test, I probably want to know about their aerobic power, their VO2 max, probably want to know their hemoglobin, how much oxygen they can carry in their blood. Runners need to be very mentally tough, so I may want to test that under a psychological test. And then a skills test, maybe I'll use Coach's Eye and we'll talk about their running form. That would be an example of a good scientific test for a runner. Once you have done the scientific testing, you'll set up the profile. So you'll use your normative data, maybe it's their previous scores, maybe it's an elite athlete's performance, and you're going to do a comparison. Now, if things are very different, you may want to actually use a statistical analysis like a t-score or a z-score. If you haven't taken statistics, it's perfectly okay. Don't panic about the words. But basically, this just standardizes our scores so we can make comparisons more fairly. Once you've set up your profile, you're going to evaluate it. You'll interpret your results. You can use percentile rankings or graphs, and I'll show you some graphs on the next page. And then you want to try to interpret these as such. So take a moment and try to interpret these athletes' scores. So these are 3 different athletes. On the far left, you have a male oarsman, so that's a crew athlete. In the middle, you have a female gymnast. And then on the right, you have a male basketball player. So looking at all of this data, try to figure out what this is actually saying about the profile of this athlete. So next, once you've gotten your profile pulled together, you know what things need to be worked on, you can actually develop your program. So you have to make a decision about if this athlete actually needs an intervention plan or they just need more standard sport-specific training. But when you make this program, make sure all of your interventions and your program goals, they need to be realistic, clear, orientated, measurable, and time-bound. You may have heard of this as a SMART goal. Basically, this makes sure all of our goals have the ability to be measured and tracked over time. So now that we've finished our discussion on Chapter 2, and before we hop into Chapter 3, I want you to take a moment to reflect. So as a coach, you were asked to profile an athlete. What do you think would be the most challenging aspect of that process? So think about it, talk about it, and I will see you guys for Chapter 3. Thanks.